Kia ora koutou. No mai haere mai. It's great to have you with us. Welcome to the first of our webinar series on accelerating teacher inquiry. My name is Mark Osborne. I'll be your guide through this webinar series. And I wonder how many of those brain teasers you managed to get. I think I only got about 4 or 5, but hopefully you got a few of them. Some might have left you with you scratching your head a wee bit, but my job over the next 30 or 40 minutes is to help you scratch your head a little bit less when it comes to teaching as inquiry. We'll go into what the outcomes are and what we're going to cover in the session today in a moment, but right now let's just settle ourselves in with karakia. Me noi tātou, kia hora te marino, kia whakapapapau namu te moana, hei hurangi mā tātou I a rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa, haume huie taikie. So as I said, my name's Mark Osborne. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a teacher, educator. I work in leadership development in schools these days. Most of what I do centers around the vision of our organisation, Leading Learning, which is innovation, leadership and excellence. And teaching as inquiry sits squarely in each of those 3 areas. It is really, should be, the engine room of ongoing continuous improvement, helping us to get to innovation, leadership and excellence. If you have just wandered in from the wilderness, you might not know that this is the first of 5 webinars. So this one is on accelerated teacher inquiry. We've got 4 others to come, one on bias in the brain, quality questions, data-informed decision-making, and effective intervention. And those topics are not random. They are designed to address the 5 most common failure points for teaching as inquiry in schools. Those failure points being that teaching as inquiry is often seen simply as a compliance activity, something to do to get the monkey off your back, and it's therefore not valued or prioritized. That's very much around culture, what I call a pro-inquiry culture, or a culture that values inquiry. So this session's very much going to be around how to establish a culture or the groundwork for every teacher, every leader, everyone in your school to value continuous improvement through the mechanism of teaching as inquiry. Bias in the brain, it's an interesting one. Our brains are notorious shortcut machines. And what we like to do is get a quick, fast, easy answer. And what that sometimes does is it shortcuts deep analysis. And in order to undertake effective interventions, we need to really deeply understand the challenge that we're working with. So we'll look at the brain and some of those synaptic shortcuts that the brain is notorious for using, and how we as teachers and leaders can circumvent some of those shortcuts to lead to really deep analysis and maybe rely slightly less on instinct or hunch. We know that the quality of question is essential for a quality inquiry, and that 3rd session there will look at some approaches to create really effective questions. Data literacy and data-informed decision-making is an area that teachers consistently say that they would like more exposure to, or more capability in. So that's what data-informed decision-making will do. And interventions, effective interventions, that's where we'll bring my PhDs in change leadership. And so we'll look not only at how to find effective interventions, but also how to implement them successfully. What's the research behind how to get shifts in practice, how we ourselves can shift practice, but how we can also support others to do that. In terms of outcomes from this particular session, as I said, it's very much about culture. So what we're looking to do is understand how to create a pro-inquiry culture, or a culture that values teaching as inquiry. We'll understand how adult learning theory plays into that, because our culture needs to be aligned with that. And one takeaway for you is that you should have at least one very concrete, practical action that you can undertake. I call them Monday ready. It might be a Friday ready or a Tuesday ready, but a Monday ready action that you can take to strengthen the culture of inquiry in your team or your organisation. Before we get too far, I just want to define terms. We're talking about teaching as inquiry here. It goes by many names. There are many different models. It might be referred to as collaborative inquiry. It might be a spiral of inquiry, practice analysis, conversation, teaching sprints, structured case reviews, improvement cycles. There's a whole bunch of different names for what we really talk about in terms of inquiring into our own practice. I'm not going to advocate for a particular model, any one of those. What I think that misses the point. The most important thing is to inquire into your practice and make incremental improvements in terms of teaching and leading, and therefore improve outcomes for learners. Really, what we're talking about, teaching as inquiry, is any kind of structured cycle where we investigate, we test, we refine, we improve, we make incremental changes to our practice. We're notorious in education for doing huge pendulum swings. We'll go 100 miles in one direction and then 100 miles in another direction. That's not the way to create great practice. Great practice often comes from small changes, small steps every day, little micro improvements. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce this guy. No, it's not my twin brother. This is Sir Dave Brailsford. And the reason I'm introducing him is a very good mentor of mine years ago said, Mark, don't even make a point without telling a story, and don't tell a story without a point. And so Dave Brailsford's going to be a really useful vehicle for us to understand cultures of improvement, cultures of innovation, but hopefully there's a point to the story somewhere. The story, I'm calling it the unconventional wisdom of transformation. Let me tell you a little bit about Dave Brailsford. He took over the Great Britain cycling team, so the Olympic cycling, but also things, their competitive teams. In 2002, up until that point, Team GB had only ever won a single gold medal in the 76-year history of cycling in the Olympics. 2002, Brailsford takes over. 2008, Beijing Olympics. That team wins 7 out of the 10 gold medals available to them in track cycling. They also form a professional racing team and go from no rider ever having won the Tour de France to winning it in 2012, 2013, 15, 16, 17, 18. Obviously, something quite spectacular happened between 2002 and 2008. What do you think it was? What enabled Brailsford and the team to achieve that transformation? And the reason I ask that question is because the temptation is to say he threw out everything that they'd done in those 76-year history and started afresh, because whatever they were doing up until that point wasn't working. So let's just start afresh. Let's chuck it all out. Let's start with a blank piece of paper. There's a real temptation to think that that would work, that would achieve that sort of transformation that we're talking about. He didn't do that. In fact, he did the opposite of that. And what he did was he asked the team, and he took it, the philosophy himself, to look at absolutely everything that they do and try to improve it by just 1%. Not 100%, we're not throwing it out, but just 1%. And so they started to find things like bike seats. They looked hard at their bike seats and said, we could probably make those more comfortable, make them, I don't know, more aerodynamic, help the riders in some way. They looked at the suits that they wore and the materials that they were using in the suits and try to improve the 1%. What they ended up doing was coming up with a massive list of things that were all improved 1%, 2%, 3%. Improved bike seats, the grip of the tires. They created these special heated shorts that meant that the muscles were warm when the cyclists got onto the bikes. They used sensors to track how each of the team responded to workouts. They literally used wind tunnels to test different fabrics. They tested different massage gels. They also went so far, they got a doctor to come in and teach them how to wash their hands, because if they wash their hands properly, like a surgeon does, then they won't be as sick as often. That's 1%. They tested pillows for the riders to sleep on at night, because each had a different preference for pillows, and a good night's sleep is 1%. So 1%, 1%, 1%. These were all tiny little incremental improvements that ultimately led to 7 out of 10 Olympic gold medals. And this is the way that he described it. The whole principle came from the idea that if you broke everything down that you could think of that goes into riding a bike and then improved each one of those things by 1%, then you'll get a significant increase when you put them all together. And so that philosophy has become known as the aggregation of marginal gains, just little marginal gains, 1%, 1%, 1%. When you aggregate them, when you put them bike back together and the whole system back together, you've achieved a huge amount. So what's the point of the story? The point of the story is we're not riding bikes, but what we're doing is we're teaching. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of tiny little points that we could improve 1%, 1%, 1%. And together, when we collect those up, they make a significant difference to outcomes for kids. So it's a very powerful metaphor, and it's a really compelling story about transformation, because the logic is we should go for revolution, throw everything out and start again. But actually, the research and experience tells us that it's probably evolution. We need to get those 1% gains. And so this is the graph that's used to describe the aggregation of marginal gains. The red line is if you make mistakes all the time, the cyclist doesn't get a good night's sleep, they get sick, the tires slip, the seat's uncomfortable. The red line just gradually falls away as those things compound. But if you get them right, the green line starts to kick in. And so in sport, that's quite easy to measure because you've got timing and track cyclists and all that sort of stuff. But for what we do, what we're looking for is a shift in student learning. And so if we, with the best of intentions, best will in the world, make those 1% mistakes, potentially we're having an impact on the amount kids learn over the course of a day or a term or a year. And if we can make those 1% little adjustments, it becomes a very, very significant improvement. So here's a little challenge for you. What would those 1% things be? What are the bicycle seats, the tires, the racing suits, the pillows? What are those things for teaching? I'm just going to give you 1 minute to think about what that is. So my time is not working. So 1 minute to reflect on what the little marginal things are that when we put them all together would make a significant gain. If you're on your own, then just think, jot some ideas down. If you're sitting next to a person, have a chat with them about what you think those 1% gains are when it comes to teaching. All right, people, there's our 1 minute. I wonder what you came up with, because I spent a little bit of time just jotting some things down, thinking if we could get a little improvement in that, together, that make quite a difference. And, I think if we can build slightly better relationships with our kids, if we can tune into who they are and what they bring to the classroom, little 1% gain, we spend a lot of time doing that already. But can we just get that little bit better? Is it about how we engage or get them to engage with the learning and feel a sense of motivation, a little 1%, they're 1% more motivated to engage with what it is that we are teaching them, what we're exploring? Is it around 1% gains in learning intentions? Is there a way for us to phrase our WALTs or our learning intentions just slightly better? Maybe we use a consistent framework for it, or maybe we make sure that every WALT has 1, 2, 3 things and just a 1% gain. Maybe it's daily routines. Can we get slightly better at transitions so that kids get from one activity to the next as quickly as possible, and we just remove, 30 seconds or a minute of downtime? Aggregated across the entire year, that would make a really big difference. Is it around having a slightly better lesson structure? Can we find better ways of making learning visible, or better approaches for explicit teaching? Is it feedback or feed forward? Can we find better ways of doing that? Maybe it's behavior management. Maybe it's all that science of learning stuff, retrieval practice, all those things. So I wonder what you came up with on your list. There's a quick, fast brainstorm for me. But the crucial point here about Dave Brailsford and what we do is that every single one of those can be improved through a process of teaching as inquiry. And in fact, if I think about a really amazing school environment, I think about every teacher in every class thinking about how they can improve one of those things or something different that they've identified, making consistent progress day after day, week after week, to improve and refine. And then we put all those gains back into the system, join it back up, and you share what you've been working on, I share what I've been working on, we take lessons from each other. That's where we see that green line of student learning start to accelerate. I think that's a really powerful vehicle for ongoing continuous improvement. That's why I'm so passionate about teaching as inquiry, about ongoing continuous improvement. There's a great saying here around success. It's just a few simple disciplines like continuous improvement, or inquiring into our practice and making small steps every day, practice every single day. Whereas failure is actually just the same errors, a few small errors in judgment every day. And that, to me, that quote describes the difference between the red line and the green line. What we want to do is practice those small, simple disciplines of continuous improvement, inquiring, reflecting, measuring impact often, and aggregate those gains. So when we think about Dave Brailsford's progress, one way of thinking about it is the technical changes that they made: bike seats, racing suits, tires, pillows, all that sort of stuff. But I'm going to suggest to you that while that made a huge difference, the thing that ultimately made the difference between 1 medal and 7 out of 10 medals wasn't necessarily those technical things. It was actually a bit of a zoom out and something slightly bigger. I want to argue that it was actually the creation of a culture that made the difference. The changing of all of those individual technical things relied on a culture that valued continuous improvement. And so it was that culture that valued marginal gains, a culture that values relentlessly pursued excellence. Every conversation between athletes, every training session, every day was dedicated to doing a little bit better, a little bit faster. And that's where we come to this idea of a pro-inquiry culture. Because if a school organisational culture doesn't value marginal gains, doesn't value inquiry as a vehicle for ongoing professional improvement, then you're not going to do that. You're not going to find those little 1% gains. You're not going to look at the bicycle seats or the tires and find opportunities to make those better. And that idea of culture, I want to introduce the idea of a traveling mindset. It comes from Alain de Botton. And my argument is that Dave Brailsford created a traveling mindset in Team GB. What is a traveling mindset? I've got a quote here. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but it describes the way that we are when we travel, when we go overseas or we go somewhere new. And what we tend to do is notice details and things that are different from our own lives, and we pick up on them in ways that the locals don't. And so Alain de Botton, in one of his books, he describes the way that we are when we travel. And he says, being receptive, we're receptive when we go to countries overseas. We carry with us no rigid ideas about what is or isn't interesting. We kind of have fresh eyes when we travel. And he says, we risk getting run over because we're intrigued by the roof of a government building or an inscription in a wall. We find supermarkets or hairdressers' shops unusually fascinating, dwell at length on the layout of a menu or the clothes of the presenters on the evening news. We're alive to the layers of history beneath the present, and we take notes and photographs. And this is the crucial bit. Home, by contrast, finds us more settled in our expectations. We feel assured that we've discovered everything interesting about our neighborhood, primarily by virtue of our having lived there for a long time. It seems inconceivable that there could be anything new to find in a place where we've been living for a decade or more. We've become habituated and therefore blind to it. So this traveling mindset is really what Dave Brailsford created in Team GB, because they, rather than just walking past the bikes and the training, suits and all that sort of stuff and just saying same old, they turned on their traveling mindset and said, why is that like that? Is that the best way that we could do things? Sure, we've been doing it for ages, but could we improve that? And that traveling mindset is essential to teaching as inquiry. What we might be is habituated and therefore blind to elements of our own practice just because we've used them for ages. It's likely that we won't see opportunities to improve those things if we're habituated and blind to them. What we need to do is see them with fresh eyes, rather than saying, well, that's just how I've always started my lessons. We say, is there a better way of doing this? I've done that for ages, but there might be an improvement that I can make. Or this is the best way to manage behavior. And we need to stop and say, is it really? Maybe there are better ways of doing things, incremental improvement. So that creation of a traveling mindset meant that they didn't walk past things that were just part of the furniture, part of the wallpaper. What they did was they started to look at absolutely everything. My argument to you was it was the creation of that culture that really made the difference for Team GB. So this is where we get to it. How do you create that culture? How did he do it? How does anyone create organizational culture? Typically, most of the research shows these 5 things that you can do to nudge, create, adjust organizational culture. One of them is tell stories. And what I hope I've done is demonstrate through the telling of the Dave Brailsford story, that's a powerful tool for us to have a shared language of what we're talking about. And stories are a very powerful medium for communicating culture. You can tell stories about anything, but you have to be really selective about the stories you want to tell. I chose that Dave Brailsford story because it demonstrates so many things about teaching as inquiry. For you, thinking about your stories and your culture, what is the culture you want to build? What do you want to strengthen in your organizational culture? And which stories will best help you do that? So that's one, stories. But we also can use history as an embedding mechanism of culture, a reinforcement mechanism of culture. What's happened in the past? Where has your organization come from? What things can we point to that are really significant turning points? How has your organization incrementally improved and achieved great things by taking small steps every day? By linking back to your history, you're strengthening culture. You'll also have a set of explicit values. That might be vision, it might be value statements, it might be whakatauki, might be anything that you've agreed are a consistent set of values. Link inquiry, link continuous improvement, link the traveling mindset and curiosity to those values by saying, this is what we stand for around here, and this is an inquiry is a way that we can live up to those values. You're strengthening them. Rituals are really powerful as well. So these might be big rituals like celebrations at the end of the term or end of the year, but they might also be little things like the way that you begin and end a team meeting or a staff meeting, or they might be little funny awards that you have on Friday. Rituals reinforce the kinds of behaviors you're looking to achieve. And they're often quite closely tied to what we refer to as heroic figures. So these are people who exemplify those values and live and breathe the way that we want to operate. When we hand out a chocolate fish or celebrate someone, even just mention in a shout out, well done to so-and-so for this, we're sending a message to everyone who's hearing that person is living and breathing those values. The tricky thing around heroic figures is that it shouldn't be the same heroes every time. And in fact, every single one of us in the organization should be acting to be a heroic figure. We should all be trying to exemplify those values. And so it's about making sure that it's like catching the kids being good. Whenever anybody in a team or organization does something that links to the kind of culture we want, we've got to celebrate it. It's a very powerful tool for creating culture. So what does that look like practically? How might we create a smart risk-taking culture? And this is where we start to get into some of those concrete, practical, Monday-ready things that you might use. I'm a big fan of what I call try it out days. And rather than asking everybody to innovate every day, because that can be quite exhausting, if people are quite shy or reluctant, we don't want them to innovate, never, but we don't want them to feel exhausted because they're changing everything all the time. A good middle ground is try it out day. And so we might say week 6, Tuesday, everybody try something new. I don't care what it is, don't care, what time of the day or what learning area, but just try something. Everyone does it. What are you going to try? Share the results of the practice. And that enables people to set a challenge that's within their level of comfort. We're not pushing them out of their comfort zone. And while that might lead to complacency, people try really low-hanging fruit. What often happens is that they try something and they see that it works. So they try something else and they see that that works and they see that works and they gradually stretch themselves. But this is like the first domino to go, the try it out days. A ritual you might institute is something along the lines of a tortoise award. You hand out somebody who's making progress. There's a couple of important messages here. Slow and steady wins the race. We don't award the hare award, who's the person who's screaming ahead, making incredible progress. What we're looking for is small incremental progress. But why is it called the tortoise award? Because a tortoise is an animal that only makes progress when it sticks its neck out. And so there's a bit of a gag and a joke there. But, once a fortnight, twice a term, hand out a tortoise award to somebody who's, making progress. Slow and steady wins the race. A check-in routine is something that typically happens at the start of a meeting, so staff meeting or team meeting, and you can use them for emotional check-ins. How's everyone's day? We're going, thumbs up, thumbs down. But you can also use them to reinforce culture. And so a check-in routine could be, what's over the last 2 weeks, what's 1% gain you've experienced, or what's one thing that you've tried? And so we go once around the table, or in a staff meeting, you get 3 people together into a triad and do a little buzz group. What have you tried? What have you tried? What have you tried? That's a ritual, and it reinforces the fact that, oh, that's right, I should be trying something, or what have I been doing? And the more you use them, the more they embed that into culture. We might use success and struggle shares. And so have, again, buzz groups and staff meetings, or it might be once around the table in a team meeting or department meeting. What is one success you've had over the last 2 weeks, and what's one thing that you haven't nailed yet, one thing you're still struggling with? And the power of that is that it normalizes struggle, because we're sometimes too hard on ourselves as teachers. We only like to present the finished product, the perfect thing. And we know that learning is messy and it's untidy, and at times you make a step forward and a step back. But by normalizing not just the successes, but also the struggles, we make it safe for people to say, I haven't nailed this yet, or something I'm still working on. And that's the next 1%, the next 1%, the next 1%. It might be a rotating spotlight where once in a team meeting, or week 1 is me, and I'll share something that I'm working on. Week 2 is you. Week 3 is the next person. Week 4 is the other person. And we share by going around, this is one thing I'm working on at the moment, and I might invite feedback on that and say, is there anything I've overlooked, or has anyone tried something like this in the past? And the spotlight's on me and my 1% for that week. Next week, it's somebody else. That's a very powerful vehicle for setting a culture that normalizes 1% incremental gains, inquiring into practice. The opposite of a check-in routine is a check-out routine. And these happen, as you probably worked out, at the end of a meeting. And so just as we finish, we might close by saying, okay, once you're on the table, what's one thing that each person is going to try over the next 2 weeks? 1%, one small gain. Or was there anything that came up in this in our conversation during this meeting that you want to try? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And so it just gets it clear what people's commitment is to that 1% gain. Another thing that we can do to make it kind of safe to take smart risks is to just talk with the team around what is a smart risk. We only want to take smart risks. We don't want to take silly risks. Silly risks often feel unsafe and they feel dangerous. And actually, big risks often don't pan out. Big changes, those are our pendulum swings. What we're more likely to achieve good progress with is small steps every day. And so let's draw a line down a piece of paper and say smart risks are things like making 1% improvement, trying something and seeking evidence of whether it works, getting student voice, to improve your practice. Silly risks might be chucking everything out and doing something brand new, or doing something that hasn't got any research sitting behind it. I reckon that's a silly risk. Don't waste your time on that. But just defining what we mean by smart risk and silly risk means that people have got a list of things that they can go to for smart and silly risks. So there are those are some practical, tangible ways of implementing the smart or the embedding mechanisms of culture. I'm aware of the time, and I'm not going to give you time to talk about this. I was going to give you a couple of minutes, but this is your reflection. How might you strengthen a pro-inquiry team or staff culture? Were there some ideas in that set that I ran through that you think might be useful? What's your one takeaway? And of course, you'll be able to rewind this recording to have a look at those. But the other thing that I'm going to give you is I'm going to send an email to people who have registered for this webinar. And that email is going to have a link to this document. In this document, you can scan the QR code and get it right now if you like. This is our Leading Learning's infographic on strategies for developing a smart risk-taking culture. And so some of those, the Tortoise Award is in there. And so some of those things that I've covered, those are the things that are most likely to make a difference when creating a pro-inquiry culture. I just want to move into cultures of adult learning, because teaching as inquiry sits really squarely into in cultures of adult learning. And this jumping off point here is Malcolm Knowles, who's an Australian researcher, done a huge amount of work on adult learning. And he says the short version is, if we know why we're learning something, we as adults know why we're learning something, and if the reason fits our needs as we perceive them, we will learn quickly and deeply. And I think teaching as inquiry is at its most powerful when people are working on things that are meaningful for them, that connect to their practice. And in fact, that links up with adult learning theory. When we talk about the design of learning or the how of learning, we often use the phrase pedagogy. That's really code for that. But the root of the prefix peda means child. We think a pediatrician or orthopedics, it's actually related to child. And so pedagogy, technically defined, is the kind of learning that works best for kids, for younger people. And as you can see there, typically it's really clearly structured. We break big concepts down into units and topics and learning areas, and it's really clearly structured. Kids often learn things in a just-in-case version. You're learning a lot of maths before you ever need to put that maths to work, because it's going to be useful for you in the long run. Incremental, exploratory, and socially supported. The word to describe adult learning clearly and technically is actually andragogy. Andra as opposed to peda, andra meaning adult, or close to meaning adult. And adult learning has to be different from what we do with kids. So instead of being structured and guided and just in case, adult learning works best when it's problem-based and just in time. So within the context of inquiry, it should be an issue that you're experiencing in your class. The data is telling you that. The student voice is telling you that. Feedback and observation is telling you that. That's a problem that you feel a sense of ownership for. That's a challenge that you want to work on. And you don't work on learning stuff that might be useful in 3 years' time. That's not motivating for me. What's motivating for me is solving a problem right now. There's a challenge that I've got coming up, and I want to work on that. And it often, because most of us are pretty good at being self-actualizing learners, we often have the skills for that learning to be self-directed. So we can take a process and apply it to our own learning. It needs to be connected to our experience, and it's ideally reflective and collaborative. And so that's why individual teaching as inquiry is often not as successful as collaborative inquiry, because we get people to bounce our ideas off. We get people to challenge us and check our blind spots and suggest other ways of doing things. And we work within a community of practice. But this adult learning model, or adult learning theory, developed by Knowles and a bunch of other people, those 5 things there, problem-based, just-in-time, self-directed, experience-connected, and reflective and collaborative, those are the features of teaching as inquiry, particularly collaborative inquiry, professional learning groups where people come together and work on something that is a challenge for them. So that's another reason why I think I'm a passionate supporter of teaching as inquiry. I think it's a really powerful vehicle for what we're doing. And what I hope I've done over the course of this session is talk about not only why it's important, but also how to create a culture that values it. So from here, I'm going to bring things to a close shortly. As I said, that is webinar 1 in a series of 5. Webinar 2, bias in the brain. As I said, there's a lot of research that shows that we tend to rely more on hunch and intuition when we make decisions rather than systematic evidence analysis. And a lot of that comes from our brain and our brain's a preference for shortcuts. We like to speed things up, but in the process of speeding things up, we often don't fully analyze issues or challenges that we're facing. So in that webinar, I explore 5 common forms of bias that can undercut or diminish the impact of inquiry. Quality questions, that'll look at the features of successful inquiry questions. Some are more likely to set up successful inquiries than others. And in fact, the takeaway from that session is a set of question frames to help people structure effective inquiry questions. Really clearly defined, really measurable, high impact areas of research. Data-informed decision-making. Teachers typically feel that they don't have enough capability in data literacy. This is actually a really fun session because when we look at Coca-Cola and Kodak, 2 big corporate giants, and they famously made really big mistakes about the way that they gathered and analyzed data, and they made really significant, costly errors to their business because they didn't have sufficient data literacy. We take those 2 case studies and convert them into a set of 7 guiding principles for data literacy. And then the final session, effective interventions, that's not it's equally about finding interventions that are likely to work, but also around the implementation. And so, as I said in the summary for that one, life's too short to back bad ideas. We should only choose ideas that are likely to make a difference. So we should only back winning horses. But you can also say about that, it's not enough to back a winning horse. You also have to ride it well. So that session will look at how to implement and support the implementation of those small incremental improvements. So the way that it works is this webinar is free. It's the freebie, but if you do want to take part in those others, there's a subscription to them. But as a thank you for being part of this webinar, for the next week up until that bias in the brain webinar kicks off, there's a 10% discount, which is applied at checkout. I'm going to send an email very shortly with all this information so you don't have to remember it. But again, you can rewind the video. But if you do want that 10% off, then just head along to the website and register for it and enter that code at checkout. While I've got you, some of you are familiar with the book that I've published recently. It's called the Middle Leadership Manual. I know some of you are using it. That's 100+ leadership ideas, tools, and frameworks. Again, I'll send a link to that. You're madly snapping all these QR codes, I'm sure, but I'll send a link with all the details. And then the final thing is at Leading Learning, we produce a free newsletter with the latest information on future-focused education, innovative practice, change leadership, and it's called A Dangerous Thing because it's just a little bit of learning several times a term. And of course, that quote comes from Alexander Pope, a little learning is a dangerous thing. And so that link there, again, it's free, jump on board and stay in touch. The final thing for me to do is just to close this off with karakia. Thank you so much for being part of this. I hope it's useful. And if you did find it useful, feel free to share the link with anyone else you think might benefit from it. So, me no tātou, ka whakeiria te tapu kia wāti aitiara. Kia tūro ki whakataha ai, kia tūro ki whakataha ai, haume, huie, tai kia. Kia ora whānau. Have a really great rest of your day.